So I'll start with kind of the ridership of the buses here in Montgomery. The buses were predominantly occupied by Black occupants. I want to say it was like 75 to 80. It might have been higher than that, but I want to say 75 to 80% of those who rode the buses were um, Black patrons of the Montgomery bus boycott. And they also faced a lot of resistance and opposition. As like I said, you can't talk about the Montgomery bus boycott without talking about Joanne Robinson, who also had an experience like Rosa Parks. Claudette Colvin, who was younger, also had an experience. So they knew that these things were happening on the bus, and also having the conversations like, look, it's the majority of our people who are riding the buses. We shouldn't be faced with this treatment. And so their idea was to hit them where it hurt. And so it was that financial impact of not riding the buses that hurt Montgomery, but it just wasn't the bus lines. I can't remember the number of buses that closed within that year, but they lost several lines just within that year alone. And as a result, people weren't visiting retail shops like they normally were. But two reasons. One is because they were not taking the buses, and the other is because of the retaliation and intimidation that they were facing, which was a little different than the segregated, like you can't go in through the front door. And so what we saw happening from that is across the country, people started saying, wait a minute, if this can happen in Montgomery, this can happen other places. So as a result, though, it hurt Montgomery in the long term because stores did actually have to close, and it just wasn't stores in the Black community because a lot of the stores downtown were white owned. But the Montgomery bus boycott actually had some of them closing their doors. I think you can't talk about the Montgomery bus boycott without talking about Joanne Robinson and her work with the WPC. And when they began to strategize, I think at one point she actually wrote a letter to the mayor hinting that there might be a bus boycott. I don't think it was taken seriously, and that's why you get the response that you got, because they actually thought that they were going to intimidate and instill fear in the Black people who were walking. I mean, you're talking about even when they had the cabs and they were using the funeral home cars and the community cars and all of that, police then started arresting them. Right? They would get stopped for these minor traffic stops and sometimes being hauled off to jail. But in the face of that, what they realized was that they're feeling the impact of this because the bottom line is the dollar. The story is interesting here in Montgomery because the person who was head of the Department of Transportation at the time also had affiliations with the Klan and very much familiar with the Montgomery bus boycott. And that was at the forefront of his mind when he said yes to this interstate being put in. But we saw it happening all throughout, not just, especially in the South, but it happened in other parts as well, where there were thriving Black communities, segregated, but they were thriving. And bringing in the interstate and the highway split the property. And so then you had homes that were taken away, businesses that had to close because of zoning laws and zoning things that had to be put into place. And so held a community meeting and almost affirmed that he was going to say no. And the next day, the answer was yes. And the interstate came in like immediately. So you think of this area over here next to Alabama State where Dr. King's house was. There was a pharmacy, there was a hotel, there was the barbershop. And you talk to people who lived here and grew up in that area, and they talk about how it was thriving, even with Oak Park, right? There was this one point where the white people said, no, Oak Park belonged to us. And Black people couldn't even walk through Oak Park, even though it was in their neighborhood. It was in their segregated neighborhood, in their segregated community. And that's the power of that retaliation. And even when we think about white flight in a lot of our communities throughout Alabama, I'll speak for that specifically. A lot of that is tied to where the dollars will go. I'll never forget when I first moved here to Montgomery, there was this thing, everything east of Taylor Road, and that's going to be its own county and city. And it's almost there. So you have Pike Road, who's annexed from Montgomery. And although they taught that it's very diverse, when you break down the numbers, it's really not. But then you look at the amount of money that's gone out there. They're like 6 miles from the first Montgomery City School. And the dollars and what's invested into the schools, stark differences. Stark differences.